All right, buckle up, because today we are diving into a real historical head-scratcher.
Oh, yeah.
The Palestinian refugee crisis.
Okay.
It's something that we hear about all the time.
Right.
It's so rarely understood with any real depth, I think.
Yeah. It's a story that's often told with a lot of emotion, understandably so.
Right.
But I think what people miss sometimes are all the historical complexities.
Yeah.
And those complexities really challenge some of the common narratives that we hear about this.
Yeah, and that's where Joan Peters comes in.
Exactly.
Her book, From Time Immemorial, is what we are diving into today.
Yes.
And what makes this book so fascinating is that she actually started out as a supporter of the Palestinian cause. 7 years of research later, she's singing a different tune.
And I think that's what's so crucial. Peters wasn't some ideologue with an axe to grind.
Right.
She was genuinely seeking answers.
Yeah.
And this whole journey that she went on, from advocate to critic, fueled by meticulous research, I mean, this wasn't just some passion project.
Right.
It makes her findings all the more compelling.
Totally. If she changed her mind after all that digging, there's something here worth unpacking.
Absolutely.
And one of the most shocking things Peters uncovered is how the UN actually changed the definition of refugee, specifically for the Palestinian situation.
Yeah, that's right. And I think for our listeners, imagine being told that you're a refugee.
Okay.
Entitled to compensation, even though you were born decades after a conflict, in a totally different country.
Right.
That's the reality that this sort of unique definition created.
So how is the definition different?
So the original definition of a refugee was pretty clear-cut. Someone who is forced to flee their home because of persecution or war.
Makes sense.
But when it came to the Palestinians, the UN added on this whole other layer. Anyone who resided in Palestine for just 2 years prior to 1948 was designated a refugee.
Hold on. Just 2 years? That's it. So you could have moved there for work a couple years earlier and suddenly you qualify.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it gets even crazier because this definition wasn't just for them. They extended it to their descendants. So somebody born today outside of Israel could be considered a Palestinian refugee if their grandfather had lived there in the 1940s.
That's a lot to wrap your head around. It's not even about the people directly displaced by the 1948 war anymore. It's like inheriting refugee status.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Peters argues, I think convincingly, that this change, which was driven by political pressure at the time, has had some major consequences.
Such as?
Well, first, it inflated the refugee number significantly.
Right.
And perhaps even more importantly, it's been used to perpetuate this narrative of victimhood
Right.
across generations.
Okay, so you're already seeing how numbers can be spun.
Yes.
But what about just the bigger picture of what life was actually like in Palestine before 1948?
Now that's where things get really interesting.
You know, we always hear about Palestine in the 1940s as this thriving, almost idyllic society that was uprooted. But Peters found some pretty different stuff.
Yeah, it's a very powerful image for sure.
Right.
But Peters' research, drawing on everything from land records to first-hand accounts, paints a much more nuanced picture.
So what was not a thriving society? What did she find?
Well, according to Peters, Palestine in the 19th and early 20th centuries was actually sparsely populated.
Okay.
And it struggled with diseases like malaria. And here's a really interesting thing. A lot of the land was controlled by these wealthy absentee landlords called effendis.
Effendis.
Yeah.
What are those?
So basically, imagine the wealthy elite, often absentee landlords.
Okay.
And they held a lot of power in Palestinian society. They owned these huge tracts of land, and most Palestinians worked for them as tenant farmers, often living in poverty.
Wow.
And get this, Peters actually found a detailed British map from the 19th century, and it basically shows a nearly empty Palestine.
Wow. Empty map.
Yeah.
That kind of speaks for itself.
I know, right? And here's another wrinkle. Peters argues that Jewish immigration, spurred by Zionism, actually brought some positive changes to the region.
Really? How so?
Think about it.
Oh.
Jewish immigrants, they came with capital, they had expertise,
Okay.
they had this drive to develop the land. This led to agricultural advancements, new industries popping up. Ultimately, this created more jobs and improved living standards for everyone.
So it wasn't just this one-sided story of displacement.
Right.
There was an actual pull factor for some Arabs to move to Palestine because of these opportunities.
Exactly. They were drawn to the area by the prospect of work, a better life. You can actually see that reflected in the migration patterns during that time period, during the British Mandate. Many Arabs actually migrated to Palestine seeking work in these developing Jewish areas.
Yeah, that's definitely a side of the story we don't often hear. It kind of reframes how you think about those pre-war years.
Yeah, and it shows how important it is to go beyond the surface and really delve into the complexities. And speaking of complexities, Peters also uncovers something else, and it adds a whole other dimension to the story.
Okay.
The Jewish exodus from Arab lands.
Oh, right, yeah. I remember reading about this in the book. It's always seemed like such a hidden part of the story.
It is, and it's absolutely crucial, I think, for understanding the bigger picture here. So, following Israel's independence in 1948, an estimated 850,000 Jews living in Arab countries,
Wow.
places like Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, were forced from their homes.
Forced?
Yeah. They faced persecution, violence, anti-Jewish laws, you name it.
Wow.
Their property was confiscated, their citizenship revoked, they had to flee.
It's crazy how that mirrors the Palestinian refugee experience. It's almost the exact same thing, just flipped.
Yeah.
And the numbers are almost identical.
Exactly. And this revelation, which, again, Peters backs up with tons of historical data, it reframes the whole narrative.
For sure.
It's not just about one population being displaced, it's about two. A tragic, two-sided population exchange that resulted from this conflict.
It makes you wonder why we don't hear more about this parallel exodus.
It's a question worth pondering, for sure.
Well,
But
yeah.
shifting gears a little bit here.
Okay.
Let's talk about land ownership. Because really, at its core, this conflict is about land.
Right.
Who has the right to it?
Mm-hmm.
What historical claims are at play?
This is where it gets really interesting, historically speaking, because it's easy to get lost in the present-day conflict, but what was the actual lay of the land back then?
Yeah.
Legally, historically, all of it.
Yeah. To really grasp this, we need to rewind back to the early 20th century as the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. After World War I, the League of Nations established something called the Mandate for Palestine, which was entrusted to Great Britain.
Okay, the mandate system, that's always been a bit fuzzy for me. What's the deal with that?
It's actually pretty straightforward. Think of it like this. Imagine a powerful country being entrusted with helping a region gain independence.
Okay.
That was the idea behind the mandate system. These powerful countries were supposed to administer these territories and help prepare them for, self-governance.
Gotcha, like a temporary guardianship. So what did this mandate say about Palestine specifically?
This is where it gets really important. The Mandate for Palestine explicitly recognized the historical connection of the Jewish people to Palestine.
Okay.
And get this, it called for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
Wow, so even back in the 1920s, there was this international legal recognition of a Jewish right to a homeland in that region.
Absolutely, and this wasn't just some vague suggestion. This was enshrined in international law. But of course, as with most things in history, it gets a little more complicated than that. This is also around the time that Transjordan, what we now know as Jordan, was created.
Right, so the land originally designated as a Jewish homeland was already significantly reduced in size, right?
You got it. The British, who were administering the mandate, decided to carve out 77% of the territory east of the Jordan River to create what was called the Emirate of Transjordan, which later became the independent nation of Jordan. And that left just 23% of that original land for a Jewish homeland.
So basically, the proposed Jewish state was shrunk before it even really got off the ground.
Right.
And then, to make matters even more complex, the UN stepped in with the partition plan in 1947.
Right. Exactly. The UN, recognizing the complexities and the competing claims, they proposed dividing that remaining land into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jewish leadership accepted the partition plan, but the Arab leadership rejected it outright. And that ultimately led to the 1948 war.
And we all know how that ended up. It's mind-boggling to think about all of this historical context, especially when you consider the question that Joan Peters brings up. Was there even a distinct Palestinian people before this conflict?
It's a question that might make some people bristle, but it's something that Peters delves into, again, with a lot of historical backing. And what she finds is that this distinct Palestinian national identity, as we understand it today, really emerged more so in response to Zionism. Before that, it was much more fluid.
So you mean people living in that area didn't necessarily identify as Palestinian?
Not in the same way. Peters argues that they largely saw themselves as part of a broader Arab or even Syrian population.
Interesting.
And she points to the fact that there weren't really any unique cultural markers, no distinct language, traditions, or customs that truly separated them from other Arab populations before the 20th century.
Wow, that really throws a wrench into things. It challenges this whole narrative of two distinct groups with long-standing claims to the same land.
Exactly. And Peters actually backs this up by quoting prominent Arab leaders, including Yasser Arafat himself, who admitted in interviews that the idea of a distinct Palestinian people was, at least in part, a political strategy to oppose the creation of Israel.
Okay, so where does all of this leave us? It feels like we've just scratched the surface of a very complicated history.
That's the thing about deep dives like this. They often leave you with more questions than answers. But what I think is so crucial is that Peters gives us a really important framework for critical thinking about this conflict.
Absolutely. It's not about taking sides.
Right.
It's about understanding the nuances, the historical context, the competing narratives that have shaped this conflict for over a century.
Precisely. And sometimes uncovering those hidden truths, those inconvenient facts, that's the first step towards, a more meaningful dialogue and hopefully a path toward a more peaceful future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been a real eye-opener. For our listeners, if you're ready to go even deeper down this rabbit hole, we highly recommend checking out Joan Peters' From Time Immemorial.
Yes.
It's a dense read, but trust us, it's worth it.
Yeah.
You'll never look at this conflict the same way again.